On an evening of singular gloom, when the London fog lay so thick upon Baker Street that the gas lamps along the thoroughfare burned as little moons in a yellow sea, Dr. John Watson sat by the hearth of number 221B, reflecting that there are seasons in a man's life when quiet is as disquieting as tumult. Holmes had been uncommonly silent throughout the day. 3 times Watson had looked up from his medical journal to find his friend stretched full length upon the sofa, his long arms folded, his hawk-like profile cut into sharp relief by the firelight. His keen grey eyes, however, remained half-closed, as though their owner had retired from the world in body, but not in mind. On the table nearby lay a mess of newspapers, some a week old, others that very morning's, with certain passages marked in blue pencil. A thin coil of tobacco smoke curled upwards from the Persian slipper upon the mantelpiece, from which Holmes had just taken enough strong shag to fell a lesser man. It was Watson who at last broke the silence. "You are uncommonly meditative tonight, Holmes," he remarked. "I had thought the absence of any considerable crime would have left you in better spirits." Holmes opened his eyes fully and regarded his companion with a faint, sardonic smile. "My dear Watson," said he, "the absence of crime is, to my mind, a symptom rather than a condition. The metropolis never truly sleeps, it merely chooses its hours of candour. If the newspapers are dumb, it is because Scotland Yard is deaf. You suspect some mischief that has yet to reach the press? I perceive rather that mischief has reached the press and been mislabelled as mere misfortune." He gestured with his finger toward the nearest paper. "You have not, for example, read the account of a curious fire in Bloomsbury yesterday?" Watson confessed that he had not. "Then you are spared the agony of contemplating the prose style of the reporter, which is far more incendiary than the incident it describes," Holmes observed dryly. "But we shall come to that. I fancy, if I am not mistaken, that we are to have our own visitor before long." He had scarcely spoken when there came a brisk rapping at the street door below. Watson started and turned his head. "You actually mean it, Holmes?" "I rarely expel breath without intention, Watson," Holmes replied. "Our caller is a man of some means but thorough anxiety. You will hear that Mrs. Hudson is obliged to open the door twice, once for him and once for his impedimenta. There. You can distinguish it by the difference in the weight of the footsteps. Indeed, the sound of someone entering and then setting down something heavy echoed up the stairwell. Voices murmured, Mrs. Hudson's placid tones and a man's more hurried, agitated speech, followed by a hesitating tread upon the stairs. "You observed all that from the mere sound?" Watson asked. "From the sound and from you," said Holmes with a twinkle. "From me?" Your hand instinctively went to your moustache at the knock. You do that only when you anticipate a case, not when you fear a bill. The rate at which the knock was delivered bespeaks urgency but not desperation. He is not a tradesman nor an officer. And as for his baggage, well, let him show you himself. The door opened, admitting a man of perhaps 35 years. Well, but somewhat soberly dressed in a travelling suit, his boots marked with recent mud. He carried in one hand a stout leather valise, which he set down with visible relief. His face, lined more with care than with age, held that peculiar air of having slept little and thought much. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, with a glance from Holmes to Watson and back again. Holmes had risen at once. "I am he. Pray come in, sir. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You bring with you the air of the provinces and a problem that has preyed upon you for at least 2 nights. You have travelled up from the West Country, I think, and in some haste." The stranger stared. "That is perfectly correct. I left Exeter this morning, though how you know—" Holmes waved aside the question with a slight inclination. "It is easier to explain," said he. than the problem that has brought you here, which I trust is not so simple. Will you sit near the fire? You will find the London damp more penetrating than the Devonshire mists. Watson, you will oblige me with the whisky and water." Watson poured out a measure while their visitor lowered himself into the armchair, casting a sidelong glance at Holmes, as though half afraid that any movement or gesture might betray further secrets. "I perceive," Holmes went on, "that you have left home under some pressure of time. Your cuff is unevenly linked, and your cravat tied with less care than a man of your station would allow himself if the hour were of his own choosing. The mud upon your boots is of a reddish clay peculiar to certain lanes between Newton Abbot and Exeter, and the faint scent of salt upon your coat is not of the Thames. But let us pass from these trivialities. You have something of greater moment to lay before us." The man seemed to gather himself together. "My name, Mr. Holmes, is Edward St. Clair," he began, "and I come to you from a small village near Torquay called Blackwater Combe. I am by profession a solicitor, though my matter tonight has little to do with law and much with—" He hesitated. "With what appears to be the impossible." Holmes's eyes brightened. He seated himself upon the edge of the table, his long fingers steepled, his gaze never leaving St. Clair's face. "The impossible," said he, "is merely the improbable in disguise. Pray be as precise in your narrative as you can. You will find that my friend here is an admirable recorder of facts." Watson took up notebook and pencil, almost unconsciously, his medical training lending itself easily to the role of chronicler. "It concerns," St. Clair continued, "the recent death of a man named Sir Neville Lockhart, a baronet of some standing in our county. You may have heard the name." "I have," Holmes said. "A racing man and sometime patron of the turf clubs, twice married, if I recall correctly, and with rather more creditors than companions. Pray proceed." "Sir Neville maintained a house named Grey Court, a short distance from our village. I have acted in some legal matters for him. 3 nights ago he was found dead in his private study under circumstances which—" Again St. Clair's composure faltered. "Which none of us can satisfactorily explain." "A crime, then?" Watson ventured. "The coroner has returned a verdict of death by misadventure," St. Clair replied with some bitterness. "But I and others who knew the man are not satisfied. The local constabulary is out of its depth, and the matter, as I shall describe it, has already given rise to rumours that—" He glanced diffidently at Holmes as though ashamed of the word. "That there is something unnatural about it." Holmes' expression grew more intent, though he gave no overt sign of excitement. "Let us keep our feet firmly upon the ground. Describe the scene as you found it." "Very well. Grey Court is an old house, Mr. Holmes, late Georgian, with some modern additions. Sir Neville's study is on the ground floor at the back, looking out over the gardens. It is a room Sir Neville prized greatly, and he kept it, as he said, for his private meditations and calculations. No servant entered without express permission. He sometimes passed entire evenings there, locked in." "Locked from the inside?" "Yes. The door possesses a heavy mortice lock and a bolt, both on the inside. Sir Neville was particular about his privacy." "A bad sign in a baronet or a baker," Holmes murmured. "Proceed." "On the night in question," St. Clair drew a breath, "there was a small dinner at Grey Court. I was among the guests. Sir Neville seemed in good spirits, though somewhat preoccupied. At about 10 o'clock he excused himself, saying that he must attend to a matter in his study, and that we might amuse ourselves at cards. He left us in the drawing-room. That was the last time any of us saw him alive." "Who were present at this dinner?" Holmes asked. "Myself, Lady Lockhart, his second wife, Mr. Hugh Davenant, a neighbour and friend of Sir Neville, Miss Alice Ray, Lady Lockhart's cousin who resides with them, and the local vicar, the Reverend Mr. Pritchard. Besides these, of course, the servants, a butler, housemaid, and 2 maids-of-all-work. The house is not largely staffed. And the time of death? Holmes inquired. The village doctor, Dr. Felton, places it between 11 and midnight. You shall hear why. For about an hour after Sir Neville left, we continued in the drawing-room. At some point, Lady Lockhart sent the butler, Jameson, to inquire if Sir Neville intended to rejoin us or preferred to be left undisturbed. Jameson returned shortly, saying that the study door was locked and that he had received no answer to his knocking. Lady Lockhart thought nothing of it. Sir Neville's moods were well known to her. A spasm of emotion crossed St. Clair's face as he spoke of Lady Lockhart, but he mastered it. It was only when, at near midnight, the vicar declared that he must return to his vicarage that Lady Lockhart again became uneasy. She bade Jameson ask Sir Neville whether he would see the reverend gentleman before he left. Jameson returned once more to say that there was still no response. At that point I suggested that perhaps Sir Neville had fallen asleep or been taken unwell. A reasonable conjecture, Watson observed. So we thought, Doctor. It was agreed that we should make sure of his well-being before allowing the vicar to depart. We all went down the corridor to the study. I recall that Lady Lockhart seemed somewhat pale and agitated. Jameson knocked loudly on the door and called Sir Neville's name. There was no answer. Did you hear any sound from within? Holmes interjected. None whatever. The house was curiously still. It was then that the butler proposed forcing the door. Lady Lockhart hesitated. She said Sir Neville would be furious to discover his precious privacy violated, but the vicar insisted on grounds of charity. I confess I shared his concern. And the door? Holmes asked. We had to break it open with a shoulder and a poker from the grate, St. Clair replied. Sir Neville had not only locked it, but also drawn the bolt. It took us some minutes. At last the wood splintered, and the door gave way. He paused, as if the memory pained him. Well, Mr. St. Clair, Holmes prompted softly. We found Sir Neville seated at his desk, his head fallen back, his eyes staring at the ceiling. There was a curious expression upon his face, half astonishment, half terror, as though he had seen something unexpected at the last moment. On the desk before him lay a number of documents, some covered in figures and notes. His right hand had fallen to his side. His left, St. Clair shuddered slightly. His left rested upon a candlestick. A candlestick, Holmes repeated. Yes, Mr. Holmes, that is the heart of the matter. A single candle stood upon his desk, a thick white taper in a brass candlestick. It had burned almost entirely down, melted into a strange, twisted mass of wax, such as might be left after a long night. The wax had overflowed and run upon the blotter, and even upon Sir Neville's sleeve. Yet, he leaned forward, his voice dropping. Yet the wick itself was scarcely blackened. There was no soot upon the ceiling, nor any odour of burnt tallow in the air. The candle had, to all appearance, burned without burning. Watson felt a slight chill, though he told himself it was only the draught from the window. Holmes's eyes flashed. What of the gas lamps, the grate? Any other source of flame? The grate was cold, St. Clair answered. Sir Neville preferred not to have a fire in that room. He said it stifled him. There was a gas bracket on the wall, but the tap was turned off. Only the candle had been lit. And even there, Mr. Holmes, the servants swear that the candle, which was placed upon the desk at dusk, was a new one, unburnt. Lady Lockhart herself had seen Jameson set it there. Yet when you entered, Holmes mused, you found a candle almost consumed, with scarcely a trace of flame upon the wick, and Sir Neville dead beside it. What was the cause of death given? Dr. Felton pronounced it heart failure, brought on perhaps by excitement or exertion. Sir Neville was not a strong man. He suffered from palpitations. There was no sign of violence upon him, no wound or bruise. The window was fastened on the inside, and the chimney so small that no man could pass through it. The room, in short, was locked and sealed, and its occupant dead, while the candle that should have burned it down to a stump had somehow devoured itself without fire. Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace the room, his hands clasped lightly behind his back, his head thrust forward. "You will understand, Mr. Holmes," St. Clair continued, "why such a circumstance has given rise to superstitious talk among the villagers. The servants whisper of ghosts and witchcraft. Some say Sir Neville had made a compact with the devil and was claimed by him at last. I, as a man of law, cannot accept such fantasies, and yet—" His voice faltered. "And yet I cannot explain what I saw." "Nor can Scotland Yard, I presume," Holmes remarked. "The matter has not been placed before them. The local inspector is content with Dr. Felton's verdict. Lady Lockhart is anxious to avoid publicity, but I cannot rest easy. There were other peculiarities, a faint scorch upon the desk where no flame had touched, a smell not of smoke, but of something sharp and disagreeable, as though a lightning storm had visited a single room. I fear there is more here than misadventure." Holmes ceased his pacing and resumed his seat. "You have brought with you," he said, nodding toward the valise, "certain papers or objects connected with the case, I think?" St. Clair started. "Yes, indeed. I have with me copies of Sir Neville's accounts, and some of the memoranda found upon his desk that night. I also persuaded Dr. Felton to allow me to bring the candlestick itself, though the candle, of course, is utterly destroyed." Holmes's thin fingers drummed once upon his knee. "You have been commendably thorough, Mr. St. Clair. Before we examine these, let me ask you a final question. Why, in the name of all that is reasonable, did you not go first to your local authorities, or at least to Scotland Yard, instead of travelling to London to consult a private individual?" St. Clair's answer was quiet, but firm. "Because, Mr. Holmes, whatever killed Sir Neville Lockhart did not pass through the door or the window or leave a mark upon his body. It is my belief that he was murdered by means which no ordinary policeman would even think possible, and I have heard it said that when a crime is impossible, it is you who makes it possible to understand." For a moment there was utter stillness in the room, save for the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Watson, watching his friend's face, saw a familiar light kindle in Holmes's eyes, a cold, clear flame, far more formidable than any that might dance upon a candle-wick. His lips curved into the slightest of smiles. "You have done wisely to come to me," said Sherlock Holmes. "You present me with a locked room, a dead baronet, a candle that devours itself without fire, and a household full of nervous witnesses. It is a combination calculated to stir even my jaded appetite." He rose and touched Watson lightly on the shoulder. "Pack your bag, Watson. There is a train to the West Country at 8:15 tomorrow morning. Before the week is out, we shall see what light may be thrown upon this singular candle and the shadow it has cast upon Greycourt." Watson closed his notebook, his heart already quickening at the prospect of a new adventure. As St. Clair opened his valise and produced the brass candlestick, gleaming dully in the lamplight, none of the three men in that modest sitting-room could yet foresee how far the strange case of the candle that burned without fire would lead them, to the secrets of a troubled household, to a science perverted from its proper course, and to a revelation that even Sherlock Holmes himself would admit had for one brief instant challenged his reason. But of these things, Watson thought, the chronicle must speak in its proper order. for now there was only the promise of a journey into mystery, and the quiet, inevitable movements of Holmes already aligning themselves toward the truth. The following morning broke raw and windy, with a skittish rain chasing tatters of cloud across a pale London sky. Watson, who had risen earlier than his custom, found Holmes already in the sitting room at Baker Street, his lean frame outlined against the window as he glanced idly at the passing hansoms below. The brass candlestick brought by Edward St. Clair stood upon the table between them, a mute and somewhat sinister witness to the conversation of the previous night. Holmes regarded it with an expression which Watson had come to associate not so much with curiosity as with intellectual appetite. "A commonplace object, is it not, Watson?" he remarked as he drew on his gloves. "There is no instrument so innocent that it cannot become, in the proper or improper hands, an accomplice to crime." "You believe, then, that it is an instrument?" Watson asked. "I believe nothing as yet," Holmes replied. "I merely note that where an ordinary mind is content to see an absurdity, I prefer to suspect an explanation. Come, our cab will be waiting." St. Clair joined them at the foot of the stairs, his valise again in hand, though noticeably lighter now that its most curious cargo had been relinquished. The journey to Paddington and the bustle of the great terminus provided that familiar sense of transition which Watson always felt before a case. London's roar falling away behind them, the long ribbon of rails stretching out toward whatever mystery awaited in the countryside. Once established in their compartment, with their luggage safely stowed, and the train beginning its steady rhythm westward, Holmes settled into a corner, his long legs drawn up, his chin upon his chest. Watson might have supposed him asleep, had he not noticed the faint glimmer behind the half-closed lids, and the occasional flick of his eyes to St. Clair's face as the latter spoke. "You will oblige me," Holmes said at length, "by going over once more, as succinctly as you can, the disposition of the household at Greycourt. I do not yet see my way." St. Clair assented readily enough. "As I mentioned, there is Lady Lockhart, Sir Neville's widow. She is perhaps 30 years of age, a handsome woman of French extraction. She married Sir Neville some 3 years ago after the death of his first wife, who left him a daughter, Miss Constance Lockhart, but she resides for the most part with an aunt at Cheltenham. A second marriage with an adult daughter in the background," Holmes murmured. "A promising arrangement for the Chancery Courts, if not for domestic peace. And Lady Lockhart's disposition?" "She is of a nervous but kindly nature," St. Clair said. "I have always found her gracious and considerate. Sir Neville, however, was not the easiest of men. He was alternately indulgent and tyrannical. There were rumours that she had not been entirely happy in the marriage." Holmes' eyes opened a little wider. "Rumours from whom?" St. Clair coloured faintly. "In a village one hears things, Mr. Holmes. The servants' tongues wag. Mr. Hugh Davenant, Sir Neville's neighbour, is much at Greycourt, an old friend of the house, a gentleman of independent means. He and Sir Neville were frequently together at the club in Torquay and on the moors. Some say that his attentions to Lady Lockhart were more constant than Sir Neville might have liked." "Yet you give me the impression that the baronet was more absorbed in his own concerns than in his wife's admirers," Holmes observed. "That is true enough. Of late, Sir Neville had been much preoccupied with various schemes, investments, racing, and, I believe, some scientific enterprise. He spoke of making Greycourt a centre of modern experiment, though what he meant I cannot say. I did, however, see in his study certain apparatus, wires, glass tubes, and a curious metal coil whose purpose I did not understand." Watson glanced up quickly. "You did not mention that last night?" St. Clair looked apologetic. "In my agitation I may have omitted details. It is only upon reflection, It is always upon reflection that the essential emerges, Holmes interposed, not unkindly. Pray continue. What of Miss Alice Ray? Miss Ray is Lady Lockhart's cousin, St. Clair answered. She is younger, perhaps 24, lively, intelligent, and, if I may say so, a trifle too outspoken for our village tastes. She has lived at Greycourt for the past year, having no fortune of her own. She is devoted to Lady Lockhart, and I have observed in her a distinct dislike of Sir Neville. She did not attempt to conceal it. One does not readily tolerate tyrants by the hearth, eh, Watson? Holmes murmured. Yet we must be careful not to convert dislike into motive without warrant. Lastly, the vicar. Mr. Pritchard is a gentle, rather timid man of about 50, St. Clair said. He is fond of his comforts and easily cowed by strong personalities. Sir Neville held him in some contempt, I think, but he was obliged to invite him on occasion. The village watches how often the baronet attends church. The servants? Holmes asked. There is Jameson, the butler, an old retainer from Sir Neville's father's time, Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, a parlour-maid, Jane, and 2 younger maids, Sarah and Ellen. Rather a meagre staff for so large a house, but Sir Neville had been retrenching of late. Retrenching? Holmes' eyes flashed again. Yes, it was common knowledge that his finances were strained. He had sold 3 horses during the last season and given up his London pied-à-terre. There had been some sharp words, I believe, between him and his principal creditor, a money-lender in Torquay. I know nothing definite, but the atmosphere at Greycourt had been tense. Holmes said nothing for some minutes. The train rattled on through a succession of wintry fields and small, grey-faced towns. At length he drew from his pocket the little memorandum book which he carried and jotted down a few lines. "Let us, for the moment," he said quietly, "place in one column a man of uncertain temper, impaired health, and failing fortunes, a much younger wife, a neglected daughter, a neighbour and friend whose attentions may overstep the bounds of mere civility, a household reduced and therefore perhaps overburdened, and a collection of scientific instruments in the hands of a layman. In the other column we set a locked room, an unmarked body, a candle that has melted without consuming its wick, and an odour like that of a thunderstorm contained in 4 walls. Somewhere between those columns a line can be drawn. We have yet to find where." "And your own hypothesis?" Watson could not help asking. Holmes smiled slightly. "My dear Watson, if I were to indulge myself with hypotheses at this stage, I should be sunk. I have 1 or 2 ideas, not of the crime, but of the candle. We must test them upon the spot. Until then, we will keep our minds as clear as the Devonshire air we are approaching." The remainder of the journey passed in fitful conversation and long silences. By the time they changed at Exeter for the branch line to Torquay, a singular gloom had descended upon the landscape. A fine rain swept over the hedgerows, and the sea, visible in grey stretches beyond the fields, looked as cold and indifferent as the stone of an old tomb. At Blackwater Combe, a modest station with a single platform and a shed for a waiting room, a dog-cart awaited them, its patient cob steaming in the chill air. St. Clair took the reins himself, and they drove through a narrow lane between high banks, where the dripping branches arched overhead. Here and there Watson glimpsed the clustered roofs of the village, the square tower of the church, and beyond, upon a gentle rise, the sombre outline of Greycourt. It was a house to depress the spirits even on a bright day, long and low, its grey stone walls blotched with lichen, the windows narrow and set deep, the whole surrounded by a neglected garden where the shrubs had grown ragged and the gravel paths were worn to bare earth in places. As they drove up, the front door opened, and a man in black livery came down the steps. "Jameson, I presume?" Holmes murmured. The butler confirmed this by introducing himself with a stiff bow and a face in which professional dignity wrestled with obvious anxiety. He took charge of their luggage and led them into a chill, high-ceilinged hall, where portraits of severe-looking Lockharts glowered from the walls. Lady Lockhart awaited them in the drawing-room. Watson, entering behind Holmes, was struck at once by her appearance. She was indeed handsome in a fragile, almost over-refined way. Her dark hair swept back from a face that must once have been radiant, but now seemed drawn and pale. Her eyes, large and dark, moved restlessly from one to the other of them, and her hands, clasped at her waist, betrayed their trembling by the slight quiver of the lace at her cuffs. "Mr. Holmes," she said, in a voice whose faint French accent lent it an added softness, "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you have come. Mr. St. Clair assures me that if anyone can bring light into this dreadful darkness, it is you." Holmes bowed with grave courtesy. "I shall do my poor best, Lady Lockhart. You will understand that I must begin by making certain inquiries and, with your permission, by examining the room in which Sir Neville met his end." A fleeting expression, something between fear and reluctance, passed over her features. Yes, of course, only—" She glanced at St. Clair. "It is a terrible thing, Mr. Holmes. The servants are half mad with fright. They say the room is haunted." "Fortunately," Holmes replied with that dry inflection Watson knew so well, "ghosts have as yet shown little talent for eluding the laws of physics. If there is anything in that room which should not be, I shall hope to find it, and if there is nothing, we shall be the better for knowing so." She inclined her head, as though taking comfort from his certainty, and rang the bell. "Jameson will take you. I cannot go there again, not yet." "Your ladyship need not," Holmes said gently. "Dr. Watson and I will trouble you with further questions later." Jameson, summoned, led them from the bright, if cheerless, drawing-room into a dim passage at the rear of the house. The air grew perceptibly colder. They passed a door which Jameson indicated with a slight bow as the library, another that led, he said, to Sir Neville's instrument-room, and then came to a heavier door at the very end of the corridor. "The study, sir," he murmured, with an involuntary lowering of his voice. "We have not altered anything, as you required in your letter, Mr. St. Clair, save that the body has, of course, been removed." Holmes drew a deep breath, not of emotion, but Watson knew to register the air upon his keen senses. He touched the splintered edge where the lock had been forced. "You have done well," he said. "Now, gentlemen, if you please, we shall step into the room where a candle burned without fire, and a man, by all appearance, died of nothing at all." Jameson stepped back as Holmes pushed open the battered study door, the hinges giving a low groan as though resenting yet another intrusion. The room beyond was dim, despite the daylight filtering through a single, narrow window at the far wall. Heavy curtains had been drawn aside, but seemed reluctant to admit the weak Devonshire sun. A stale chill clung to the air, an atmosphere of abandonment, as if the room had held its breath since the night of Sir Neville's death. Holmes stood motionless upon the threshold for several seconds, his gaze sweeping the chamber in one long, deliberate survey. Watson, familiar as he was with such moments, refrained from speaking. St. Clair, however, shifted uneasily at his side, and Jameson cleared his throat with the subdued air of a man who would never dream of interrupting, but was uncomfortable nonetheless. The study was longer than Watson had imagined, furnished in a style that suggested both wealth and neglect. A great mahogany desk dominated the centre, its surface crowded with scattered papers, the brass candlestick, and pewter inkwell. A cold, empty grate yawned beneath the mantel on the left, above which hung a portrait of some Lockhart ancestor whose austere gaze seemed fixed reproachfully upon the intruders. Along the right-hand wall stood shelves laden with books, boxes, and the scientific paraphernalia St. Clair had mentioned: coils of copper wire, glass tubes, a stack of metal discs, and a curious lantern-like device. That caught Holmes's eye at once. But it was the desk, more precisely, a faint, irregular marking upon its polished surface, that drew Holmes forward. Without a word he approached, anchoring his fingers behind his back as he leaned over the blotter. Watson moved to his side and noticed at once what Holmes had detected: a subtle, dark stain, scarcely larger than a man's palm, directly before the chair where Sir Neville had last sat. "That was not there before," Jameson murmured nervously. "At least, I never saw it so plainly." Holmes tapped the surface lightly. "Not ink, not wax either, a scorch, yet not from flame." He bent lower, his nose almost brushing the surface. "A faint singeing. Yes, but of what nature?" "You remarked last night," Watson said quietly, "that Mr. St. Clair noticed a smell like that of lightning." Holmes nodded, though his brows knit. "Ozone, or something akin to it, but we must verify." He turned sharply to Jameson. "Has anything been touched here since the night of Sir Neville's death? Anything at all?" "Nothing, sir," the butler replied, stiffening at the suggestion. Dr. Felton examined the body, of course, but he did not disturb anything beyond that. Lady Lockhart ordered us all to leave the room as it was. Holmes gestured approvingly. A wise precaution. He straightened, then paced slowly around the desk, stopping before the narrow window. It was set deep in the wall with thick mullions, and Watson observed at once that its latch was secured. "A single means of ingress besides the door," Holmes murmured. Taking out his pocket lens, he inspected the edges of the sill and the latch, his long fingers tracing lightly over the wood. "No scratches, no sign that it has been opened in some time." Holmes then turned suddenly to Jameson. "You were the first to break in, I believe?" "Yes, sir. With Mr. St. Clair and the others behind me." "And the door was bolted and locked from within?" "Both, sir." Holmes examined the damaged lock, running his fingers over the splintered wood, tilting his head with that peculiar intentness that Watson had often likened to a hound catching a scent. "Very forcibly done," Holmes murmured. "You used a poker, Mr. St. Clair." St. Clair nodded. "It took some effort." "So I see." Holmes stepped back, then regarded the room again, his gaze narrowing toward the cluster of apparatus near the shelves. "Now, what have we there?" He crossed swiftly to the scientific equipment. Watson followed and saw Holmes lift the curious lantern-like device with extreme caution. It was made of brass and glass, with a coil of thin metal wires spiraling within. "Have you any notion, Mr. St. Clair," Holmes asked, "what object this is intended to be?" St. Clair shook his head. "None, I'm afraid. Sir Neville spoke once of electrical curiosities, but I assumed it to be a hobby." "A dangerous hobby, if carelessly pursued," Holmes murmured. He replaced the apparatus on the shelf with gentle precision. "Yet I find no signs here of an accident in the usual sense, no exploded battery, no ruptured glass." Watson bent beside him. "Could these instruments have produced the mark upon the desk?" "Instruments used improperly can produce almost anything," Holmes said. "But I see no direct line of disturbance between this shelf and the desk. We must keep our minds open." Holmes next examined the floor, kneeling, running his hand lightly over the carpet. "The fibres here, Watson. What do you make of these?" Watson crouched and observed a patch of carpet where the pile was faintly roughened. It was subtle, barely perceptible. "Someone stood here recently?" "Or something rested here," Holmes murmured. The position suggests that something, perhaps a small stand or second object, was placed within arm's reach of the desk. St. Clair looked bewildered. "But the room was locked. Nothing has been brought in or out." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear sir, the fact that none in the house carried such an object in or out does not preclude its existence. Something has been removed by someone, perhaps before the door was bolted." This cryptic remark caused St. Clair to pale slightly, but Holmes offered no immediate explanation. Instead, he turned his attention to the candlestick upon the desk. He lifted it delicately, holding it up to the light. The wick, Watson saw, was almost pristine, barely darkened at its tip. Yet the mass of wax surrounding the candlestick told a different tale. It had melted and flowed in rivulets across the blotter, then cooled in twisted forms like congealed drippings from a long burning taper. Holmes placed the candlestick back upon the desk and folded his arms. "A candle that melts without fire," he murmured, "a scorch without heat, a man who dies without struggle. Gentlemen, every element contradicts the next, and yet together they form a pattern." The room was silent, save for the faint tick of a clock on the shelf. Holmes turned abruptly. "Jameson, you said earlier that Sir Neville kept this room strictly private. Who last cleaned it?" "No one, sir. He wouldn't have us disturb his things. I dusted around the threshold and window ledge, but I never entered unless summoned." Holmes nodded. "Then the dust might prove more eloquent than any servant." He examined the mantel, the tops of books, the corners of the desk. No disturbance here except near the floor, where the carpet pile is pressed. "Curious." St. Clair stepped forward. "Mr. Holmes, what do you make of all this?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he moved again to the window and stood, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze travelled from carpet to desk to shelves, then finally rested upon the portrait above the fireplace. "That portrait," he said suddenly. "Who is it?" "An ancestor, sir," Jameson replied. "Sir Edmund Lockhart, from the last century." Holmes stepped closer, scrutinizing the frame and wall. Watson followed, expecting to find some hidden mechanism or secret recess, but Holmes's attention moved instead to a small object on the mantel, a brass key, tarnished by age. "Did Sir Neville use this key?" he asked. "No, sir," Jameson said. "It belongs to an old cabinet in the library, I believe." Holmes replaced it thoughtfully. "Odd place to leave it." Watson heard the change in Holmes's tone, subtle but definite. Holmes turned back toward the room's centre. "We have enough for the moment," he said quietly. "But before we leave, one more matter." He crossed the room to the far corner where the carpet met the skirting board. Kneeling abruptly, he reached beneath the edge and withdrew a thin metallic chip, so small that Watson almost missed it, a curved fragment, perhaps half an inch long. "Watson," Holmes murmured, handing it to him. "Examine that." Watson held it to the light. A sliver of metal, copper perhaps, curved like part of a small ring or coil. St. Clair looked baffled. "Is it significant?" Holmes rose slowly. "Everything is significant if we place it properly in the puzzle." He stepped to the door. "Gentlemen, this room tells a story, one we do not yet fully comprehend, but which is far from supernatural. Sir Neville's death was neither the work of ghosts nor the product of chance. Something was done here with calculated purpose and with knowledge, perhaps dangerous knowledge." He paused, glancing once more at the assembled apparatus, the scorch on the desk, the pristine wick, the warped wax. "And before this day is out," Holmes said quietly, "I intend to discover who possessed that knowledge and why they used it to make a candle burn without fire. Holmes closed the study door behind them with a quiet finality, though Watson sensed at once that his companion's mind was still within that room, darting between clues like a swallow among rafters. The corridor outside felt warmer by comparison, yet some lingering pall from the study seemed to follow them, as though the house itself resented any disturbance of its secrets. Jameson hovered, visibly unsettled, awaiting instructions. Holmes regarded him for a moment, with a gaze both measured and penetrating. "You have served this household long, Jameson?" "40 years, sir," the butler replied, straightening with pride, "since Sir Neville's father was master here." "And in that time," Holmes said, "have you ever known anyone, Sir Neville included, to keep unusual company? Persons of scientific bent, perhaps, or those engaged in mechanical or electrical pursuits?" Jameson blinked at this unexpected question. "Sir Neville received many guests, sir, though fewer of late, but no one of that kind, not that I recall. He was a man of society, sir, not a tinkerer." Holmes nodded, though his expression hardened slightly, as if this answer complicated rather than simplified matters. "Very well. You may return to your duties. We shall speak again." Jameson bowed and withdrew with audible relief. Watson waited until the butler's footsteps disappeared down the hall before speaking. "Holmes, I confess myself puzzled. Do you truly believe—" He hesitated, lowering his voice, "that these instruments of Sir Neville's have any bearing upon his death?" Holmes began walking, gesturing for Watson and St. Clair to follow. "I believe, Watson, that men rarely surround themselves with tools in which they have no interest. Sir Neville possessed certain apparatus whose purpose was not decorative, a coil device, an electrical lantern, glass tubes arranged with deliberate precision. It suggests a mind dabbling where it had little business." They moved toward the library, a sombre room lined with books so old that many seemed to have retreated into their leather bindings for want of company. Holmes entered without hesitation, scanning shelves with rapid eyes. St. Clair remained by the doorway. "Sir Neville was no scientist, Mr. Holmes. He would have no knowledge of such things. He could barely operate a telegraph without assistance." "Then someone else in this house had knowledge," Holmes replied. "Or someone visited who did." His fingers paused upon a row of volumes. He drew out one, a thick, dust-coated tome titled Principles of Electrical Induction. As he flipped it open, a small slip of paper fell to the carpet. Watson stooped at once to retrieve it. "A note," he said. Though scarcely legible, he handed it to Holmes. The detective held it up to the light. The scrawl was hurried, jagged, ink blotting where the pen had dug too hard. "Primary field unstable, discharge risk, candle proximity unsafe." He read it softly, then lowered the note, his gaze sharpening. This was written in haste, almost certainly by Sir Neville. Yet the phrasing is technical. It implies knowledge well beyond the casual enthusiast. St. Clair looked astonished. "I never knew Sir Neville to speak of any primary field or anything of that sort. He talked of investments and horses, not electrical theory." "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "do you recall the scorch upon the desk and the odour like lightning?" "Perfectly." "We may be dealing not with fire, but with electricity, of a most peculiar kind." St. Clair's face had gone pale. "But how could such a thing kill a man without leaving a mark?" "Electricity can kill as swiftly as any blade," Holmes replied, "and without any outward sign if the current behaves in a particular manner. But this is conjecture. We must find more." He turned suddenly. "Mr. St. Clair, who, besides Sir Neville, had access to this library?" "Lady Lockhart, of course. Miss Ray. The vicar on occasion, when visiting. And Mr. Davenant, he has been a frequent guest." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Yes, Mr. Hugh Davenant, the attentive neighbour, the trusted friend, a man who, by your earlier account, is both intelligent and close to the household. You cannot believe Davenant. I believe nothing, Holmes interrupted, but I observe everything, and I intend to observe Mr. Davenant very closely indeed. He folded the note and placed it in his pocket, then resumed his swift survey of the library. Watson followed his gaze to a tall wooden cabinet in the corner. Its lock plate matched the key Holmes had noticed in the study. Holmes crossed to it and inserted the key. The lock clicked, opening to reveal shelves filled not with books, but with neatly arranged boxes, metal cylinders, and a thick journal bound in black leather. He removed the journal and flipped through several pages. Watson glimpsed diagrams, strange, looping sketches of coils and currents, tables of figures and phrases written in a hand too shaky to be confident. "This is Sir Neville's," Holmes murmured. "His private notes, and look here, references to field compression, heatless discharge, and, yes, candle trials." St. Clair stared. Candle trials? Holmes handed the journal to Watson, who saw an entry dated 10 days before the death. Result unsatisfactory. Wax melts rapidly, but flame impossible to sustain. Odor unpleasant, must increase output. Risk to operator unknown. Watson felt a small chill run through him. "Holmes," he said quietly, "these notes, this device, might they have produced the melted candle without fire?" "The possibility grows stronger with every page," Holmes said. Sir Neville Lockhart was experimenting with forces beyond his comprehension, but even so, his death was no accident. Someone used his own devices against him. The locked door, the arrangement of the room, the object removed from the carpet's marked place. These point to a human hand directing the event. He closed the cabinet and stepped back. "Gentlemen, before the day ends, we must speak with every member of this household. But first, one more matter." Holmes moved to the window overlooking the grounds. Mist clung to the garden below, softening its ragged edges. A figure moved near the shrubbery, a woman in a dark cloak, pausing once to glance toward the house. "Watson," Holmes said in a low voice, "observe our silent watcher." Watson stepped beside him. "Is that Miss Ray?" "I believe so, and she is watching us, not the garden." St. Clair frowned. "She is deeply protective of Lady Lockhart, but surely—" "Watson," Holmes said, "come, we shall make her acquaintance at once." He turned from the window with sudden purpose, his coat swirling behind him like a shadow. St. Clair hastened to keep up as Holmes strode toward the front of the house. Whatever secrets Sir Neville had taken to his grave, Holmes meant to drag them into the light, beginning with the woman who watched from the garden and perhaps knew more than she dared reveal. Holmes wasted no time in descending the steps of Grey Court, his long stride unconcerned with the damp earth that clung to the gravel path. Watson followed, with St. Clair close behind, though the solicitor cast an anxious glance back toward the upper windows, as if fearing that some unseen observer might disapprove of their abrupt sortie. The air outside was still heavy with mist, drifting in slow veils around the hedges, muffling sound and lending the grounds an air of secrecy that seemed wholly in keeping with the house itself. The figure Holmes had glimpsed was now moving toward the rose arbour, its cloak pulled tightly around slender shoulders. As they approached, the woman stopped and turned, revealing the pale, intelligent face of Miss Alice Ray. Her dark eyes fixed on Holmes with an unreadable expression, neither fear nor defiance, but something keen and guarded, as though she had already formed an opinion of him and intended to test its accuracy. "Miss Ray," Holmes said with a polite bow, My apologies for our sudden approach. I trust we do not intrude upon your walk." She regarded him steadily. "You intrude, Mr. Holmes, but not unexpectedly. I wondered how long it would take you to seek me out." Watson exchanged a surprised look with St. Clair, but Holmes only smiled faintly. "Then I may hope that our conversation will be mutually convenient." "That depends," she replied, her tone cool but not hostile. "If you have come to satisfy idle curiosity, I have little to offer. But if your purpose is to understand what happened in that house—" She glanced briefly toward the windows of the study, her expression tightening. "Then perhaps we may speak." Holmes motioned to a stone bench beneath the arbor. "Let us take a moment, if you please. I have observed that you were watching us." Miss Ray's lips curved just slightly. "And so I was watching you observe the study. An equal exchange, I think." Holmes inclined his head, accepting the thrust. Watson, noting the firm control in her posture and the keen intelligence behind her measured replies, found himself revising his initial impression. There was a quickness in her manner that set her apart from the more subdued occupants of Greycourt. She lacked the tremulous anxiety of Lady Lockhart and the solemn constraint of Jameson. She was younger, clever, and held within her a resolve that suggested she was not easily unsettled. Holmes studied her with the same depth of attention he gave to a rare specimen. "Miss Ray," he began, "you were present on the night of Sir Neville's death. Your cousin, Lady Lockhart, mentioned that the servants are frightened by the circumstances, and what did you think when the study door was forced open?" Miss Ray's gaze flickered, but she did not look away. "I thought that Sir Neville had finally paid the price for his recklessness." St. Clair stared. "Recklessness? Sir Neville? I cannot imagine." She cut him off with a sharp, almost impatient gesture. "You were not here these past months, Mr. St. Clair. Sir Neville had grown obsessed with those dreadful contraptions in his study. He spent hours with them, long nights, muttering to himself. He told Lady Lockhart that he was on the verge of some breakthrough that would restore their fortunes." Watson leaned forward. "Do you know the nature of this breakthrough?" Miss Ray hesitated. "Only that it involved electricity. He said he had discovered a method of producing energy without flame, something that could melt wax without burning it. He showed me once." She broke off suddenly, as if regretting the admission. Holmes seized on the hesitation. "He demonstrated it for you?" "Only briefly," she replied, her voice lower now. "I happened to be passing the study one evening and saw a flash beneath the door. A moment later, he called me in. He was flushed with excitement, and there was a strange smell in the air, sharp, like metal after a storm. He told me he had succeeded in liberating heat without fire. I thought him mad. I told him so." "And how did he take that?" Holmes asked softly. "He laughed," she said, "a high, brittle laugh. He said I lacked imagination. He said that soon the whole world would know his brilliance." "And what of Lady Lockhart?" Watson inquired. "Did she share your concerns?" Miss Ray's features softened. "My cousin was deeply troubled. Sir Neville had become unpredictable, alternately affectionate and furious. She dreaded his temper, but she hoped that whatever he was doing would come to nothing. She did not understand it, but she feared it." Holmes nodded, absorbing every word. "Miss Ray, you said Sir Neville demonstrated the effect to you. Did he use a candle in that demonstration?" She exhaled slowly. "Yes." He placed a candle beneath a small device, one with coils and glass tubes. There was a humming sound, faint but unsettling. Then the wax began to drip rapidly, though the wick never flamed. I watched for only a few seconds before I fled the room. "And Sir Neville?" Holmes pressed. He followed me to the doorway and told me I must never speak of it. He said he had enemies, people who would steal his invention if they knew. She looked intently at Holmes. I did not know whether it was true, or merely the paranoia that seemed to grip him more often as time went on. Holmes folded his arms, his eyes bright with deduction. "Miss Ray, your honesty is most helpful. You may not realize how helpful. One more question, if you please. On the night of Sir Neville's death, did you see or hear anything unusual before the door was forced?" She hesitated for a long moment. "I heard a sound, a faint crack like distant thunder. I thought it was the storm over the hills. But afterward, I was not so certain." Holmes exchanged a swift look with Watson, his excitement carefully masked. "Thank you. And you saw no one near the study?" "No one," she replied firmly. "But—" her expression grew troubled. "I did notice something strange earlier that evening. Mr. Davenant was unusually tense. He asked Sir Neville for a private word after dinner. They stepped aside near the corridor. I could not hear what was said, but Sir Neville's voice rose sharply. Mr. Davenant looked shaken." Holmes's voice sharpened. "And afterward?" "Mr. Davenant went out to the smoking room alone. Sir Neville went to his study. I thought little of it then." Holmes rose slowly from the bench. "Miss Ray, you have provided us with a most invaluable perspective. One last matter. Why were you watching us from the garden? You must have known we would notice." Her lips curved faintly. "Because, Mr. Holmes, I wished to see whether you were the sort of man who looks at the surface of things or beneath them. Sir Neville lived and died by what lay beneath." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, then bowed. "Rest assured, Miss Ray, I rarely occupy myself with surfaces." As they turned to leave, Miss Ray called softly after them. "Mr. Holmes?" Holmes paused. "Whatever you discover," she said, her voice steady, "remember that Lady Lockhart is blameless. She has suffered enough." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment, but as they walked back toward the house, Watson sensed from the tightening of his friend's jaw that Holmes had heard far more in her words than mere loyalty, and that the next steps of their inquiry would lead them inevitably to Mr. Hugh Davenant, whose private quarrel with the dead baronet might prove far more illuminating than any scientific apparatus. Holmes walked briskly back toward the house, the mist curling around his coat-tails as though reluctant to release him. Watson sensed the familiar quickening in his friend's manner, the subtle sharpening of focus, which meant that several threads of the investigation had just knotted themselves into a clearer pattern. Sinclair followed, visibly unsettled by what Miss Ray had revealed, though still clinging to the notion that the strange electrical devices in the study were no more than the eccentric amusement of a misguided baronet. "Holmes," Watson murmured as they neared the terrace steps, "I assume from your silence that Miss Ray's testimony has confirmed one of your suspicions." "Confirmed? No," Holmes replied. "But it has illuminated. There is a difference." He paused with one hand resting lightly upon the stone balustrade, his gaze directed toward the far hedgerow. Mist obscured much, but Watson thought he saw movement. Perhaps a gardener, perhaps nothing at all. Holmes, however, stared as though tracing invisible patterns in the drifting vapour. "Watson," he continued softly, "we must speak with Mr. Davenant without delay. If Miss Ray is to be believed, and I find her a singularly reliable witness, Davenant's quarrel with Sir Neville on the night of the death may prove a hinge upon which the whole case turns." Sinclair cleared his throat uneasily. "I cannot believe Hugh Davenant capable of murder." Holmes did not look at him. "Let us hope your faith is not misplaced, but belief, Mr. St. Clair, is a luxury I cannot afford. I deal in evidence, motive, opportunity, and means, and Mr. Davenant now stands adjacent to all four." They entered the house through the side door nearest the morning room. The warmth there was a welcome change from the chill outside. Lady Lockhart sat near the hearth, though she started visibly when Holmes appeared. Miss Ray had not returned inside. She was likely still in the garden, or finding some pretext to avoid crossing paths with her cousin while her emotions remained unsettled. Holmes bowed. "Lady Lockhart, forgive our abrupt return. May I inquire whether Mr. Davenant is presently at Greycourt?" She rose slightly, twisting her handkerchief in nervous fingers. "Yes. He arrived not an hour ago. He is in the smoking room. Shall I send for him?" "If you would be so kind," Holmes said gently. As she rang the bell, her eyes sought Holmes with thinly veiled apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Hugh is a friend. A true friend. I beg you not to distress him unnecessarily." "I assure you, Lady Lockhart, I have no desire to distress him, or anyone," Holmes replied, his tone mild but unmistakably firm. "My questions will be guided only by the interests of truth." The butler led them to the smoking room, a dark panelled chamber, smelling faintly of tobacco and old leather. Hugh Davenant stood near the window, his back turned, as though contemplating the fog that pressed against the glass. At the sound of their entrance he swung around sharply, revealing a lean, well-featured man of perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and a face deeply lined by recent worry. "Mr. Holmes," Davenant said, mustering a strained politeness, "I suppose it was inevitable you would wish to speak with me?" Holmes offered his hand. "Only to understand the facts, Mr. Davenant. Nothing more." Davenant accepted the gesture, though his grip was tense. "Ask what you will. I have nothing to conceal." Holmes took a seat and motioned for Watson and St. Clair to do the same. Davenant remained standing for a moment, then sat opposite Holmes, his posture rigid. "Mr. Davenant," Holmes began quietly, "Miss Ray has informed me that you exchanged sharp words with Sir Neville on the night of his death. I should be grateful if you could recount what passed between you." Davenant's jaw tightened. "Alice told you that, did she?" "Well, she is not mistaken, though her perspective rests only on what she glimpsed from afar." He drew a breath, steadying himself. "Sir Neville had been in a volatile mood all evening. He had demanded that I invest a considerable sum in one of his schemes, a preposterous electrical invention which he claimed would bring a fortune." Holmes's eyes flickered. "You refused?" "Naturally," Davenant said with a trace of bitterness. "It was madness. I told him so. I said that his obsession was draining his finances and endangering his household. He erupted. Accused me of undermining him, accused me—" He stopped abruptly, looking away. Holmes leaned forward. "Accused you of what, Mr. Davenant?" Davenant's shoulders stiffened. "Of paying undue attention to Lady Lockhart." Silence fell. Watson saw St. Clair start in quiet dismay. Holmes's voice remained steady, almost gentle. And was there any cause for such an accusation? Davenant turned sharply, meeting Holmes's gaze without evasion. "I have been a friend to Lady Lockhart, nothing more. Sir Neville was jealous by nature. His temper blinded him to reason, but I never behaved improperly." "I understand," Holmes replied. "And after this quarrel?" "I withdrew to the smoking room. Sir Neville stalked off toward his study. I remained alone for perhaps 20 minutes, thinking over our confrontation. Then I rejoined the others in the drawing-room. That is all." "And you did not see Sir Neville again?" "No." Holmes tapped a finger lightly on the armrest, thinking. "Mr. Davenant, did you ever observe Sir Neville's experiments, the electrical devices in his study?" Davenant hesitated. Only once, months ago, he insisted upon showing me a small demonstration, something involving wires and a candle. The candle melted rapidly, though it never caught fire. It unsettled me. I told him it was dangerous. He laughed it off. Watson's breath caught, though Holmes merely nodded, absorbing the corroboration. And you? Did you understand the mechanism? I am no scientist, Davenant said curtly. But it seemed unnatural, and I urged him to abandon it. Holmes regarded him with renewed intensity. Tell me, were you aware that Sir Neville believed someone meant to steal his invention? Davenant's face paled. Yes, he said as much during our quarrel. He accused me of wanting to appropriate his discovery. It was absurd. So you had no desire for the invention? Absolutely not. I wanted nothing but for him to stop. His voice wavered, then firmed again. Mr. Holmes, if you are suggesting that I harmed Sir Neville— Holmes raised a hand. I suggest nothing. I merely gather facts. Davenant stood, pacing the length of the room. I feared something like this would occur. Sir Neville's obsession was growing dangerous. He shut himself in that room, slept scarcely at all, and drove poor Lorraine, Lady Lockhart, to the brink of despair. If he had not died that night, he would have driven himself to ruin in another way. Holmes followed him with his eyes. One final question, Mr. Davenant. On the night of the death, did you hear any unusual sound? A crack, a hum, anything out of the ordinary? Davenant paused, brow furrowing. Now that you mention it, yes, a faint snap, like a whip or a spark. I assumed it was the fire in the drawing-room or a log splitting, but perhaps— Holmes rose. Thank you. You have been frank and helpful. But Watson, who knew Holmes's expressions as well as any man alive, saw something else behind that politeness, a keen, narrowing assessment. Davenant had told the truth, or believed he had, but there remained gaps, shadows, inconsistencies that Holmes was not yet ready to reveal. As they stepped out into the corridor once more, Holmes turned to Watson. He is holding something back. Watson nodded. You believe him involved? Involved? Holmes repeated softly. That word has many meanings, Watson. And before this is done, we shall discover precisely which of them applies to Mr. Hugh Davenant. He paused, listening. Far down the hall, a faint sound, hurried footsteps, echoed, followed by the distant creak of a door. Someone had been near enough to overhear. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And now, Watson, the real hunt begins. Holmes stood still for the space of a heartbeat, his head slightly inclined, as though listening for the faintest tremor in the air. Watson could almost picture the workings of that keen mind, sorting possibilities with an agility no man could match. The soft, retreating steps had already faded, leaving only silence in their wake, but Holmes's posture indicated certainty rather than speculation. Someone was near enough to overhear us, Watson murmured. Holmes nodded once, and retreated in haste the moment Mr. Davenant's voice rose. Curiosity, or fear, may drive a man to listen at doors, but only guilt makes him flee. He strode quietly to the end of the corridor, Watson and St. Clair following. The hallway branched into two narrower passages. The left led toward the servants' quarters, the right toward the rear staircase. Holmes studied the floor. Thin scatterings of dust, subtly disturbed near the right-hand wall. A woman's shoe, he muttered. Small, narrow, the pressure is light. Watson, our elusive listener, may be closer than we think. As if summoned by the very words, a soft, startled rustle came from around the corner. A quick intake of breath and the faint whisper of skirts. Holmes stepped forward sharply, but by the time they reached the bend, the corridor lay empty. Only an open door near the staircase suggested the path of the fugitive. Holmes approached it. "The morning room," he said. "And no one within." St. Clair exhaled nervously. "Do you suspect Miss Ray?" Holmes shook his head. "Miss Ray is not the sort to retreat in alarm. She would meet me head-on. No, this is someone else. Someone timorous." "Lady Lockhart?" Watson asked quietly, though he hated himself for thinking it. Holmes's expression sobered. "Possibly. But let us not leap to conclusions. Fear can silence the innocent as much as the guilty, and Lady Lockhart is already trembling on the edge of collapse." He moved away, returning along the hall with measured steps. Watson could sense the shift in Holmes's manner, a deeper concentration, a tightening of focus upon some unseen clue that had subtly changed shape since the interview with Davenant. "Holmes," Watson said, "you believe Davenant's account, at least in essence?" "In essence, yes," Holmes replied. "He admits the quarrel, he admits the accusation of impropriety, he admits seeing the electrical devices, but he omits something, Watson, something he has convinced himself is irrelevant, and what a man omits is often more revealing than what he states." He paused before the door to the study once more, and lightly touched the splintered wood. "Let us consider," he continued, "that the quarrel occurred shortly before Sir Neville retired to this room. If Davenant possessed the temperament of a violent man, he would hardly remain in the smoking room brooding. His nature is not of that sort. He simmers, but he does not boil." Watson agreed. There was a restraint about Hugh Davenant, a rigidity that spoke of control rather than impulsiveness. "And yet," Holmes said, lowering his voice even further, "someone in this house had knowledge of Sir Neville's work, sufficient knowledge to complete or augment what he had begun. Miss Ray saw a demonstration, but she did not linger. Davenant observed one long ago and dismissed it. Lady Lockhart shrank from the devices altogether." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "But someone did not shrink." St. Clair looked startled. "Who could that be?" Holmes turned abruptly toward him. "Mr. St. Clair, your duties brought you to Grey Court often. Did you ever see one of the servants lingering near the study? Any of them displaying undue curiosity? A servant is often more observant than a gentleman imagines." St. Clair frowned, searching his recollection. "I cannot say I noticed anything out of the ordinary. Jameson is devoted, Mrs. Briggs is dutiful, and the younger maids, well, they are hardly the sort to tamper with electrical machines." "Appearances mislead," Holmes murmured. "The timid often know the most." He stepped away, signalling for them to follow him toward the service passage. They found it bustling faintly with activity. The luncheon hour approached, and the servants moved in cautious, subdued motions, each glancing toward Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Holmes selected the youngest of the servants, Ellen, a pale-haired girl, scarcely more than 16, who was polishing a silver tray near the pantry. She startled visibly when Holmes addressed her. "Ellen, I should like to ask you a question or two. Pray do not be alarmed. You are not in any trouble." She swallowed, twisting her apron nervously. "Yes, sir?" "Tell me," Holmes said kindly, "on the night of Sir Neville's death, were you anywhere near the study?" Her eyes widened at once. "Oh, no, sir. We were all in the kitchen after dinner. Mrs. Briggs says we're not to linger by the master's door. He hated it." Holmes nodded. "And since that night, have you or any of the others gone near the study?" "No, sir," she whispered. "We're frightened of it. Jane fainted when she had to pass it in the dark." Holmes raised a brow. "Indeed? And what of Lady Lockhart? Has she gone there?" "Not once, sir. She can't bear to. Miss Ray goes near it sometimes, but only to fetch things from the library." Holmes exchanged a quick look with Watson. "And Jameson?" Ellen hesitated, then lowered her voice. "He avoids it too. But yesterday morning I saw him coming from the corridor looking very shaken, sir, as though he'd seen something he oughtn't." Holmes's eyes lit at once, though he hid it beneath calm professionalism. "Very good. Thank you, Ellen. You have been most helpful." As the girl slipped away, St. Clair turned anxiously to Holmes. "Do you believe Jameson knows more than he has said?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that Jameson is the sort of man who speaks only when directly compelled, and even then, with great selectivity. We shall visit him presently." Before Watson could respond, footsteps approached, measured, but quick. Miss Ray appeared at the end of the passage, her expression composed, but her eyes sharp with purpose. "Mr. Holmes," she said, lowering her voice as she neared, "I must speak with you at once. There is something you must see." Holmes bowed. "Lead the way, Miss Ray." Watson felt the familiar thrill of imminent revelation, the sense that the case, which had until now moved like a shadowed river, was about to reveal a swirl of deeper currents. And as Miss Ray led them toward a door Watson did not recall noticing before, a narrow, seldom-used entrance near the back of the house, Holmes's posture changed ever so slightly, as though bracing for the moment when the mystery of a candle that burned without fire would take a darker, more decisive turn. Miss Ray moved swiftly down the narrow passage, her cloak brushing the walls as she led them toward the obscure rear door. Watson had the unsettling sense that this was not a place intended for guests, or even for most of the household. The air grew noticeably cooler, tinged with a faint metallic scent that he had come to associate with Sir Neville's devices. Holmes followed Miss Ray with eager precision, every line of his posture sharpened by expectation. At last she halted before a small, worn door, half concealed by a hanging tapestry. The keyhole was ancient, the wood scored by the marks of generations of keys, long vanished. "This door," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though fearful of listeners, "leads to what Sir Neville called his instrument room. You passed it earlier, Mr. Holmes, but I believe you did not look inside." Holmes nodded. "It was locked." "It still is," Miss Ray replied, drawing a small, oddly shaped key from her pocket. "But I took this from Sir Neville's desk the morning after the discovery. I feared it would be misplaced or taken." Her voice trembled slightly, though she steadied it with visible effort. "I did not know then what you might need to see, but I know now." Holmes extended his hand with gentle gravity. "You have done wisely." She placed the key in his palm, and for a moment her composure broke. Fear and something like guilt flickered across her features. But she recovered swiftly. Holmes inserted the key, turned it with a soft click, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, windowless, and thick with the smell of dust, oil, and something faintly acrid. A single gas lamp hung from the ceiling, casting a pale glow over the cluttered interior. Watson's breath caught as he stepped inside. It was like entering the workshop of a man at once brilliant and deranged. Tables lined the walls, each crowded with wires, coils, glass rods, metal plates, batteries, and objects whose purpose Watson could not immediately fathom. A tall wooden stool stood before a central workbench, and on it lay a half-assembled device, a lattice of copper and glass, strangely delicate, as though one incautious touch might shatter some fragile balance. Holmes moved slowly, reverently, as though surveying the remnants of an unfinished symphony. "Watson," he murmured, "observe how meticulously the components are arranged. Sir Neville did not dabble. He pursued this with relentless purpose." Miss Ray stepped forward hesitantly. "He spent hours here. Sometimes I would hear a soft buzzing through the walls or see a faint blue glow beneath the door. He tried to hide it, but..." One cannot hide something of this nature. Holmes examined the copper coil closest to him. Remarkable. These are not the crude experiments of an amateur. They suggest assistance or access to knowledge beyond that of an ordinary country gentleman. St. Clair frowned. Assistance? From whom? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a sheaf of papers from the workbench. They were covered in figures, sketches, and momentary bursts of insight that Sir Neville had impatiently scribbled down. One diagram in particular, showing a candle positioned beneath a coil, caught Holmes's eye. Here, he pointed. This is the mechanism he demonstrated to Miss Ray, a coil of particular construction designed to produce intense heat without combustion, ingenious and perilous. A device of this sort, if improperly handled, could generate a burst of energy strong enough to stop a man's heart. Watson felt a chill creep over him. Holmes, are you suggesting that Sir Neville's death was caused not by a person, but by one of these instruments? Not by the instrument alone, Holmes replied softly, but by its deliberate use. Miss Ray clasped her hands tightly. You believe someone used his own invention against him? Holmes set down the papers with deliberate care. Someone with knowledge sufficient to replicate Sir Neville's work. Someone who knew the risks he described in his notes, purposefully increasing the output to dangerous levels. Someone who positioned an additional device on the floor near the desk, explaining the impression we found in the carpet. St. Clair looked shaken. But who here? Who would understand such things? That, Holmes said, is the question we must answer. He turned to Miss Ray. You said Sir Neville feared his invention might be stolen. Did he ever speak of who might attempt such theft? She nodded slowly. He mentioned a man in Torquay, an experimenter of sorts, Mr. Elijah Wetherell. He claimed Wetherell had once ridiculed his ideas, then later tried to purchase some of his designs. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Yes, Wetherell, I have heard the name. A man of questionable reputation, dabbling in speculative electrical research. Do you believe he might have been involved? Watson asked. Possibly. But even if Wetherell desired the invention, he was not present here on the night in question. Holmes paused, then added, However, someone in this house may have communicated with him. A silence fell. Then Miss Ray spoke in a low, strained voice. There is something else I must show you. Holmes raised an eyebrow. You seem to be the guardian of many secrets, Miss Ray. Not willingly, she said. But when a house falls into fear, someone must try to understand what has happened. She crossed to a small drawer in the corner and opened it. Inside lay several envelopes, each sealed with a plain wax stamp, but addressed in the same hand. Holmes took one, broke the seal, and scanned the contents. Watson saw a flicker of triumph, and something darker, in Holmes's eyes. What is it? St. Clair asked. Holmes handed the letter to Watson. The handwriting was elegant but forceful. Sir Neville, if you persist in ignoring my warnings, you will leave me no choice. I will not allow you to endanger others, or yourself, with your reckless experiments. Destroy the device, or I shall see to it that it is taken from you. You know I speak in earnest. H.D. Watson lowered the letter slowly. Holmes, this is from Hugh Davenant. Miss Ray closed her eyes briefly. I found them hidden in this drawer the day after Sir Neville died. Holmes folded his hands behind his back, his voice calm but weighted with significance. So Mr. Davenant warned Sir Neville, threatened him even, and yet, during our interview, he made no mention of these letters. St. Clair looked aghast. He must have had some reason, some misunderstanding. Misunderstandings need not be withheld. Holmes said sharply. Only guilt or fear of implication compels a man to suppress his own warnings. Holmes returned to the workbench, tapping the diagram with one long finger. Gentlemen, consider what we now possess: motive, knowledge of the device, and an undisclosed confrontation. Hugh Davenant may not be our killer, but he is no mere bystander. He turned back to the group, his eyes bright with deduction. And before this day ends, we shall discover what Mr. Davenant truly meant when he told Sir Neville that he would see to it that the device was taken from him. Miss Ray looked toward the door, her expression taut. And for that, Holmes added quietly, "We must speak with Jameson." Watson's pulse quickened. For the first time since their arrival, he sensed they were approaching the heart of the mystery, not merely the science behind a candle that burned without fire, but the human desperation entwined with it. And as they stepped out of the instrument room, Holmes cast one last glance back inside, as though memorizing the positions of every coil, every wire, every dangerous possibility. The trap was beginning to take shape, and somewhere within Grey Court the person who had set it in motion was waiting, perhaps watching even now, as the fog thickened outside and the corridors of the house seemed to grow narrower, darker, and more dangerous with each step they took. Holmes closed the door of the instrument room behind them with a soft click, though the tension that followed seemed to reverberate along the narrow corridor. Miss Ray lingered only a moment before retreating toward the drawing-room, clearly shaken, yet determined to conceal the depth of her agitation. St. Clair excused himself to compose his thoughts, or, as Watson suspected, to silently reconsider everything he had believed about Hugh Davenant. That left Holmes and Watson alone in the dim passageway. Holmes did not move at once. His eyes remained fixed upon the door they had just locked, as though he were weighing the contents of the room against the words they had heard, and finding in the contrast something profoundly unsettling. "Holmes," Watson murmured, "you are unusually silent." "I am thinking, Watson," Holmes replied, without shifting his gaze. "This case has taken a curious turn, not merely of science, but of psychology." He began walking with determined strides toward the servants' staircase. "We must find Jameson, now." Watson followed, though unease pooled in his stomach. He had not forgotten Ellen's fearful description of Jameson's shaken state, nor the fleeting figure overhearing them. In a house like Grey Court, shadowed by fear and secrecy, every corridor felt as though a hidden pair of eyes waited behind it. They found the butler in the pantry, arranging a tray for Lady Lockhart. The moment he saw Holmes, he stiffened, not with guilt, Watson thought, but with the wary resignation of a man who knows questioning is inevitable. "Jameson," Holmes said mildly, "might we have a word with you in private?" The butler set down the tray with mechanical precision. "Of course, sir." Holmes led him into a small alcove near the back stairs, a space barely large enough for the three of them, and closed the door. The butler's composure frayed slightly at the edges. Watson could see his hands trembling, just enough to betray what his rigid posture hid. "Jameson," Holmes began, "you have served the Lockharts faithfully for decades, that is clear, but I must ask you direct questions, and I need you to answer with equal directness. Do you understand?" Jameson swallowed. "Yes, sir." Holmes's tone shifted. Still polite, but sharpened with quiet authority. "You have been in some distress since Sir Neville's death. Why?" Jameson's gaze dropped to the floor. "Sir, I have seen things I cannot explain." "Such as?" Holmes prompted. Jameson hesitated, then drew a shaky breath. "On the morning after Sir Neville was found, I returned briefly to the study to ensure nothing had been disturbed by the doctor. Lady Lockhart asked me to fetch a letter from the desk, the one she had been expecting from her aunt. I did not stay long, sir, only a moment, but while I was there—" His voice faltered. The candlestick moved. Watson blinked. "Moved?" Jameson nodded frantically. "Only slightly, an inch perhaps, but I swear it happened. No one else was in the room. I heard a faint crack, like the sound Ellen and others mentioned, and the candlestick shifted on the blotter as though nudged by an invisible hand." "And what did you do?" Holmes asked. "I fled." Jameson's voice cracked. "And I have not gone near the study since." Holmes tapped a finger against his coat thoughtfully. "You believe it was supernatural?" "I do not know what to believe, sir," Jameson whispered. Holmes leaned closer, his voice firm. "Jameson, nothing that occurred in that study was supernatural. Something triggered the movement, perhaps residual energy from a device, perhaps a mechanical effect delayed by position or heat, but nothing magical." Jameson appeared unconvinced, but the reassurance steadied him somewhat. Holmes continued, "Miss Ray believes you saw something else, something you have not yet told." The butler flinched. His eyes darted toward the door, as though expecting an unseen listener. Holmes softened his tone. "Jameson, your silence may shield someone who desperately wishes to hide, but the truth will emerge, with your help or without it." Jameson shut his eyes briefly, then exhaled. "Very well, sir. The night Sir Neville died, I passed near the study before Lady Lockhart sent me to check on him the second time. I heard voices." Watson stiffened. "Voices? Plural?" "Yes, sir," Jameson whispered. "Sir Neville's, and another man's." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Can you swear to that?" "I would not lie, sir. I heard Sir Neville say, 'You are a fool to interfere.'" The other voice replied, low, angry, "I will stop you, Neville, one way or another." Watson's pulse quickened. "And you recognize this second voice?" "Yes," Jameson said in a hoarse whisper. "It was Mr. Davenant." A heavy silence followed. Even the faint clatter from the distant kitchen seemed to fade beneath the weight of those words. Holmes' face remained composed, too composed, Watson thought. He had anticipated something of this sort. "And why?" Holmes asked calmly. "Did you not tell anyone?" Jameson's voice cracked with misery. "Because Mr. Davenant has always been kind to my family, and because Lady Lockhart looks to him for support. If he is involved, if he harmed Sir Neville, it would destroy her." Holmes watched the man for several seconds, then nodded slowly. "You have done no wrong by telling us now." Jameson sagged in relief, as though some unbearable burden had been lifted. Holmes concluded, "One final question. When you heard these voices, was the study door closed?" "Yes, sir. Closed and locked, as far as I could see." Holmes's eyes lit with a peculiar intensity. "Thank you, Jameson. You have confirmed more than you know." The butler departed, still trembling, leaving Holmes and Watson alone in the alcove. Watson turned at once. "Holmes, if Davenant was inside the study before Sir Neville locked himself in—" Holmes raised a finger. "If he was inside, he could not leave without unlocking the door, and the bolt remained fastened when they broke it. Then—" Holmes stepped out into the corridor, his expression fierce with realization. "Then either Jameson is mistaken, unlikely, or there is another entrance." Watson's breath caught. "A concealed door?" Holmes nodded once. "Exactly. And it must open not outward into the corridor, but inward, into a place where one might hide or escape unseen." He turned toward the study with swift purpose. "And if Hugh Davenant had access to that hidden entrance," Holmes said quietly, "then the night's events take on an entirely new shape." Watson felt the thrill of revelation blaze to life. The locked room was no longer impossible. And somewhere behind one of Greycourt's ancient walls waited the answer. along with the unseen hand that had guided a candle to burn without fire and a man to die without a wound. Holmes moved with such sudden purpose that Watson had to lengthen his stride to keep pace. The corridors of Grey Court seemed to darken as they approached the study, as though the house itself were drawing inward, guarding its secrets with stubborn silence. Holmes paused just before the splintered door, his fingers brushing the wood, with the tenderness of a surgeon preparing to make an incision. "Watson," he said quietly, "everything hinges upon what we find within these walls. Davenant's guilt is neither proven nor disproven, but Jameson's testimony has given us the missing axis on which the entire mechanism pivots." Watson nodded, though tension gripped him. If a hidden entrance exists, it would explain the impossible. "More than that," Holmes replied, "it would explain the method by which our culprit arranged the scene, manipulated the device, and vanished without disturbing the bolt." He pushed open the door. The cold, stale air of the study greeted them again like the breath of some dispassionate sentinel. The scattered papers, the twisted candle wax, and the faint scorch mark awaited with their silent accusations. Holmes crossed directly to the point on the carpet, where he had earlier discovered the subtle depression, where something had once rested. He knelt, running his palm lightly across the fibres. "Here," he murmured. "This was no ordinary object. It was placed deliberately and positioned with precision." Watson crouched beside him. "Holmes, is it possible the device vanished through this secret entrance?" "Just so," Holmes said. "And if it did, there must be some mechanism to open it. Hidden, certainly, but not beyond detection." He rose and approached the panelled wall behind the writing desk. The wood, though darkened by age, bore little ornamentation, only the faint patterns of time and the occasional knot. Holmes traced each line and contour with meticulous care, pausing whenever his fingers detected the slightest irregularity. "Watson," he said after a long silence, "stand near the desk. When I signal, press gently against the far left corner." Watson obeyed, placing his hand where indicated while Holmes examined the opposite end of the panel. The detective's fingers halted near a carved rosette, so subtle and worn that Watson would never have suspected it of being anything more than decoration. Holmes glanced back. "Now," Watson pressed. The rosette clicked beneath Holmes's touch. A soft, almost reluctant creak followed. A narrow line appeared in the panelling, so fine it might have been a trick of the light, then widened as the panel swung inward, just enough to reveal a sliver of utter darkness beyond. Watson felt his pulse leap. "Good heavens!" Holmes's eyes gleamed. A concealed passage, narrow, likely built when this house served as a hunting lodge many decades ago, precisely the sort of architectural eccentricity that invites misuse. He pushed the panel further, revealing a cramped space, no more than 3 feet wide, descending by a steep wooden stair into blackness. "This," Holmes said softly, "is how our visitor entered and left. Not the way Sir Neville died, no, but the way the killer escaped detection." Watson shuddered involuntarily. "Holmes, do you intend to go down there?" Holmes smiled without humour. "I seldom decline an invitation so pointed." Before Watson could protest, Holmes had slipped inside, striking a match to cast a flicker of light over the first steps. Watson followed, unwilling to let Holmes vanish into darkness alone. The wooden steps groaned beneath their weight, but held firm. The air grew colder as they descended, heavy with dust and the faint scent of damp stone. After perhaps 12 steps, the passage levelled out. Holmes held the match forward. The corridor ran only a short distance before ending in another panel, this one clearly designed to open into a different part of the house. Holmes extinguished the match. "We must test it." He pressed gently upon the panel. It yielded at once, swinging inward with barely a whisper. Light spilled in. Not the cold gleam of the study, but the warm, flickering glow of the smoking room's hearth. Watson's breath caught. Holmes. This passage leads directly to where Davenant said he was sitting. Holmes stepped into the smoking room, scanning it with fresh eyes. Yes, and more importantly, it leads here without any need to pass the corridor. Watson frowned. But why would Davenant hide such a thing? Why not declare it openly? Holmes turned sharply. Because, Watson, the existence of this passage implicates him, unless he can account for every moment of his time. And guilt is not the only reason a man might conceal a damning truth. Fear for someone else, can be more powerful still. Before Watson could ask what he meant, the smoking room door opened abruptly and Hugh Davenant entered. He froze. His face drained of colour at the sight of Holmes and Watson emerging from the hidden door. "You found it," he whispered. Holmes regarded him levelly. "Yes, Mr. Davenant, we found it." Davenant's composure broke entirely. He slumped against the nearest chair, hands trembling. "I knew you would. I knew it. And yet I hoped." Holmes stepped closer. "Mr. Davenant, concealment of this passage is a grave matter. But before you incriminate yourself by silence, I urge you, speak plainly." Davenant pressed his trembling hands to his face. "I have lied. Not about the quarrel, that was true, but about the voices, about being entirely absent from the study before the door was broken." Watson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Then you were in the passage that night?" Davenant nodded miserably. "Only briefly, I swear it. I was worried, angered, confused. After Neville stormed off, I followed him, but only to confront him, to reason with him. He entered the study, locked the door, and began shouting at someone. I thought he was raving or speaking to himself." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "But he was not alone." "No," Davenant whispered. "Someone else was there." Watson felt the hairs rise on his neck. "But the study was locked from the inside." Davenant looked up, eyes haunted. "Exactly. And that is why I fled, because I heard Sir Neville arguing with a man who could not have entered by the door." Holmes's voice softened. "You knew about the passage?" "Yes," Davenant said, shuddering. "I knew, and I feared— God forgive me— I feared that if I intervened, I would become part of whatever horror was taking place. I heard a crack, a terrible sound, and then silence." Holmes exchanged a grave look with Watson. "And the voice?" Holmes asked gently. "Did you recognize the man Neville argued with?" Davenant swallowed. "I did, though I wish I had not." Holmes waited. "It was St. Clair." Davenant closed his eyes. "Edward St. Clair was in that room." Watson felt the world tilt for a moment. Holmes, however, simply nodded, slowly, thoughtfully, as though some final piece had slid into place. "I see," he murmured. "Then the pattern is complete." But Watson, staring at Davenant's stricken face, felt only confusion. For if St. Clair had truly been in that room on the night Sir Neville died, then the case had twisted itself into an even darker shape than Holmes had yet revealed. Holmes did not flinch at Davenant's confession. Rather, he regarded the man with a calm that suggested the final veil of the mystery had already lifted in his mind. Watson, however, felt a cold shock ripple through him. Edward St. Clair, who had brought them the case, who had seemed the essence of earnest concern, present in the study the night of the death. It seemed impossible. Holmes stepped closer to Davenant, his voice steady. "You heard the quarrel clearly?" "Distinctly," Davenant whispered. St. Clair said something about preventing another disaster, and Sir Neville shouted back that St. Clair had no authority over his work. Then came the crack of that infernal energy. I fled. I was ashamed, but also terrified. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. Then your part in this is clear, and thankfully for you, not criminal. You hid what you heard because you feared it would implicate you. Now, Watson, we must see Mr. St. Clair immediately. They found St. Clair in the drawing-room, standing near the window with a tense rigidity that betrayed a mind wrestling with its own demons. He turned as they entered, eyes hopeful, then faltering when he met Holmes's gaze. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "have you made progress?" "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Enough to require your full honesty." A flicker, fear, perhaps guilt, crossed St. Clair's features. "Ask what you must." Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. St. Clair, you were in the study on the night Sir Neville died." The solicitor went white. "That is not... Who told you such a thing?" "Truth told me," Holmes said gently. "But for now let us hear yours." St. Clair sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. When he spoke, his voice trembled. "I had hoped you would never discover it. Yes, I was there, but I swear I am no murderer." Holmes waited. St. Clair drew a steadying breath. "Sir Neville summoned me earlier that day. He believed someone was trying to steal his invention. He feared his wife would be accused if the work disappeared or went wrong. He trusted only me. I came to him after dinner using the old passage, one he had once shown me long ago when we discussed refurbishing parts of the estate." "He showed you?" Watson asked in astonishment. "Yes. Sir Neville was secretive, but at times oddly talkative when drink loosened his tongue." St. Clair's eyes darkened. He had been increasingly unstable. I confronted him that night. I begged him to abandon his experiments. I told him that the mechanism he had built, the heatless coil, was dangerous beyond measure. I feared someone would be hurt. He grew enraged, shouted that I was jealous of him, that I wanted his invention for myself. Holmes' eyes glittered. And then? He dismissed me, ordered me to leave by the passage before the others noticed. I obeyed, and that was the last I saw of him. I swear it. Watson frowned. "But Davenant heard you return." St. Clair shook his head violently. "Impossible. I left and never went back. Someone else must have entered after me." Holmes's stillness deepened. "Precisely," he murmured. "Someone else did." Lady Lockhart appeared then in the doorway, pale but composed. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "is something wrong? I heard raised voices." Holmes turned toward her with grave tenderness. "Lady Lockhart, the time has come to end this fear. May I ask you, did Sir Neville ever confide in you about his experiments, about the dangers involved?" She swallowed. "Never. He dismissed my concerns. I lived in dread of that room." Holmes nodded. "And yet someone did not dread it, someone who had both motive and opportunity to use Sir Neville's device in a lethal way." Silence fell. Holmes's gaze moved slowly from Lady Lockhart to Miss Ray, who had stepped into the room behind her, then to Davenant, then finally returned to St. Clair. But he did not stop there. He turned toward the doorway, where Jameson stood frozen, his gloved hands trembling, the tray he carried rattling softly as though echoing a hidden truth. Holmes' voice rang through the room. "No, Watson, not St. Clair, not Davenant, and not Lady Lockhart. The killer, the manipulator of Sir Neville's device, is Jameson." A collective gasp. Watson's own heart lurched. Jameson staggered back a step, colour draining from his face. "Sir, that is absurd." Holmes advanced slowly. "Is it? You, Jameson, who had served the Lockharts since youth, who saw Sir Neville grow into a cruel master, one who dismissed your loyalty and treated you as a servant rather than the confidant you fancied yourself to be. Jameson's lips trembled. I do not. But more importantly, Holmes continued, you alone had access to Sir Neville's study over many years. You cleaned what others never touched. You observed the devices long before anyone else even knew of their danger, and you alone could have understood how Sir Neville's apparatus functioned. Jameson's tray fell to the floor with a clatter. Holmes pressed on, relentless yet calm. You helped him assemble it. You fetched components from Torquay, paid for with Sir Neville's accounts. You were his unacknowledged assistant. Miss Ray gasped. Jameson, you? Jameson's voice broke. He said he would share the credit with me, said I would rise above my station, but then he belittled me, said I was merely useful hands. Holmes nodded. And so when he abandoned you, when he threatened to dismiss you for interfering, you decided to demonstrate the device's true power. He mocked me, Jameson cried, collapsing against the doorframe. Said I was nothing. Watson felt a wave of pity, but beneath it, horror. So you used the passage? Yes, Jameson whispered. When Mr. Sinclair left, Sir Neville locked himself in, but I knew he would test the coil again. I entered quietly, placed the second amplifier on the floor behind him, and increased the output, just as he'd taught me. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. And the candle melted without flame, the coil discharged, and Sir Neville died without a mark. Jameson sobbed. I meant only to frighten him, only to make him respect me, but the device. It was stronger than I knew. When he collapsed, I panicked. I removed the amplifier and fled back through the passage. Holmes laid a hand on Watson's arm. And thus the locked room puzzle is resolved. The room was sealed not by a ghostly phenomenon, but by a servant's envy and a hidden door. Lady Lockhart sank into a chair, trembling. Miss Ray knelt beside her. Holmes addressed Jameson quietly. Your suffering does not absolve your crime, but you have now confessed. The law will take its course. Jameson bowed his head in mute surrender. Later, as the constabulary led him from Greycourt, Holmes and Watson stood on the gravel drive, the mist lifting at last. Watson exhaled. Holmes, the envy of a servant. Such a small thing, yet deadly. Holmes shook his head. Not small at all, Watson. Envy is the candlewick of human passion, slow to ignite, but capable of burning without flame until catastrophe results. Watson sighed. And the others? Davenant, Miss Ray, Lady Lockhart? They are innocent, Holmes said gently. Flawed, perhaps, but guiltless. Their hearts were merely entangled in Sir Neville's troubled life. Holmes lifted his coat collar against the morning chill. Come, Watson, the case is closed, and London awaits. As they walked down the drive toward the waiting carriage, Watson glanced back at the old estate, its shadows, lighter now, its oppressive silence broken at last. In his heart he knew this case would linger in his memory far longer than most, a candle that burned without fire, a mind consumed by envy, and Holmes, always Holmes, cutting through darkness to truth with the unerring precision of a blade. A fitting conclusion to a mystery that had begun in smoke and shadow and ended in the clear light of morning.